I have been called many things in my life. The most feared duke in England, the Iron Lord of Thornvast, cold, unyielding, a man who had buried one wife and two brothers and had emerged from each grave with less of himself showing and more of the wall built higher. My steward, Hartwell, once told me in a moment of unusual frankness that the household staff drew lots each quarter to decide who would bring me my morning correspondence. I did not laugh when he told me. That, I suspect, is precisely what he meant. So when Gerald Ashby arrived at Thornvast Hall in the first week of October with a ledger full of ruined numbers and a niece at his elbow, I ought not to have been surprised that his opening gambit was a contract. Men who owe large sums and have no assets left have a habit of offering what they think is worthless. In this case, what Gerald Ashby thought was worthless was a young woman standing 2 steps behind him in the entrance hall, wearing a gray wool traveling cloak and looking not at me, but at the vaulted ceiling above, as though she were counting the corbels and finding the total more interesting than anything else in the room. "Miss Emmeline Ashby," her uncle said, with the tone a man uses when presenting a bill he hopes someone else will pay. "My late brother's daughter. She is 24. She is particular." He paused on that word as though it contained more information than he wished to give, and I understood at once that he meant it as a warning and as an apology simultaneously. I said nothing. I looked at her. She had still not looked at me. She had moved barely, so that her gaze swept down from the corbels to the line of ancestral portraits along the west wall, and she was reading the plaques below them with the careful attention of someone in a museum who has come for scholarship, not spectacle. Her face was pale and precisely still. Not nervous, still, not the stillness of a young woman trying to compose herself before a powerful stranger. Something else. A stillness that came from inside, rather than being pressed on from without. "Miss Ashby," I said. She looked at me then. Her eyes were dark gray and very direct, and the look she gave me was not the demure lowering of gaze I had come to expect from every young woman her uncle had probably paraded before half the county. She looked at me the way I sometimes looked at a problem in an account ledger, carefully, without judgment, but with the clear intention of understanding exactly what she was dealing with. "Your Grace," she said, and then, "you have 17 ancestors on that wall and only 3 of them are smiling. The plaque dates suggest the smiling ones all died before the age of 40. I wondered if there was a pattern." There was a long silence. Gerald Ashby turned a dull red at the collar. "Emmeline, for heaven's sake." "It was an observation," she said, without inflection and without apology. I believe that was the moment, though I would not have admitted it then for any sum. I believe, looking back across all that followed, that it was precisely then that something shifted in me, some small and heavily barricaded door, and whatever was behind it leaned, very slightly, toward the light. But I am getting ahead of myself. I have told this story backward enough times in my own mind that I have learned to begin at the beginning, however inconvenient it is. The beginning was a contract. The contract was as follows. Gerald Ashby owed the estate of Thornvast £11,000. The debt had accrued over 4 years of bad harvests, worse investments, and a fondness for card play that outpaced his luck. My man of business had presented me with the account in September, along with his considered opinion that recovery of the full sum in liquid capital was unlikely within any useful time frame. Ashby had a house, heavily mortgaged. He had farmland, equally encumbered. He had, it transpired, one remaining asset of any description, and that asset was Miss Emmeline Ashby, who was, by the county's collective assessment, unmarriageable. I had heard this assessment before her uncle delivered it. A woman of 24 with no dowry was unfortunate. A woman of 24 with no dowry and a reputation for peculiarity was, in the language of the drawing rooms I occasionally was obliged to inhabit, a problem without a solution. She had refused 2 offers of marriage already, both from men of modest standing who had come away from the experience shaken but unwilling to specify why. She read too much, spoke too plainly, and had a habit of saying the thing everyone in the room was thinking but nobody had said, with the specific composure of someone who did not understand why the unsaid thing had been left unsaid. She had been called odd, strange, unsettling, a trial. Her uncle, with the peculiar ruthlessness of a man with nothing left, had offered her to me in settlement, not in those exact words. He had dressed it as an arrangement, a match, a mutually beneficial contract between families. What he meant was, take the girl, cancel the debt. I had every reason to refuse. I had been a widower for 6 years and had no intention of altering that state. My household ran on silence and precision, and the studied avoidance of anything that might introduce disorder. Miss Emmeline Ashby, from everything her uncle's anxious preamble had conveyed before she walked through the door, was approximately the opposite of all of that. Then she walked through the door and counted the smiling ancestors on the wall, and I signed the contract 3 days later. I told myself it was practical. I told Hartwell it was a straightforward resolution of a debt. I told the few men of my acquaintance who inquired that the Ashby match was a matter of estate management, nothing more. Hartwell received this explanation with the particular expression he used when he disagreed with me, but had decided the disagreement was not worth his position. I pretended not to notice. The arrangement was simple on its face. Miss Ashby would come to Thornvast Hall as my intended. There would be a period of, as the contract delicately phrased it, mutual acquaintance. If at the end of 3 months either party found the match untenable, the contract would be dissolved, her uncle's debt restructured across a payment schedule that would take a decade and ruin him slowly but leave him standing. If the match proved agreeable to both parties, we would marry. The £11,000 would be forgiven. The girl would have a name, a house, and a husband who would not trouble her overmuch. That last part I meant sincerely. I was not looking for a companion. I was not looking to be known. She arrived on a gray Wednesday in the first week of November with 1 trunk and a box of books that took 2 footmen to carry and which she had packed herself. She informed them crisply, in a specific order that she expected to be maintained. I watched from the window of my study. I watched her step out of the carriage, look up at the facade of Thornvast Hall. I have been told it is an imposing sight. 4 stories of dark stone and narrow windows dating from the reign of 2 kings past, and then take out a small notebook from her coat pocket and write something in it. I could not read what she wrote from that distance. It occupied me for the rest of the afternoon that I wished I could. She was installed in the East Wing, which was the guest wing and therefore the furthest from my own rooms and the library and the study where I spent the majority of my waking hours. This was by design. I had planned, I see it now with some clarity, to keep the 3 months as sparse as possible. A formal dinner once a week, a walk on the grounds, chaperoned as propriety demanded, the requisite meetings in the drawing room. Enough contact to satisfy the terms of the contract, and enough distance to ensure that whatever peculiarity she carried with her did not migrate into the functioning of my house. I had not accounted for the library. Thornvast Hall's library is the finest room in the house, and possibly one of the finer private libraries in the county. It runs the full length of the north wing's ground floor, 2 stories of shelving accessed by a rolling iron gallery rail, a fireplace large enough to stand in, and windows overlooking the kitchen garden that let in the specific flat gray light of late autumn afternoons. I spent 4 hours in it every morning, rain or shine, and I had not had to share it with any living soul in 6 years. I found Miss Ashby in it on her 3rd morning at Thornvast Hall, before I arrived. She had lit one of the reading lamps, positioned herself in the window seat I habitually avoided because its cushions were worn, and was reading with the concentrated stillness of someone who has found exactly what she was looking for and intends to make the most of it. She looked up when I entered. She did not look startled. She did not apologize. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said. "I hope you don't mind. Hartwell said the library was open to the household from 7 o'clock. It is 20 past. She returned to her book. I stood in the doorway of my own library for what I can only describe as an unreasonable length of time. "What are you reading?" I asked finally. She held up the spine without looking away from the page. It was a volume of natural philosophy I had acquired 3 years ago from an estate sale and had not yet read myself. "It's very good," she said. "You have a note in the margin on page 43 that says absurd. I think you were wrong. The argument holds." I crossed the room. I sat in the chair opposite her window seat, which was not my chair and not my usual position, and I held out my hand. She handed me the book with her thumb holding page 43 open. I read the passage. I read my own marginal note. I sat with it for a moment. "The premise holds," I said. "The conclusion is still absurd." "The conclusion follows directly from the premise," she said. "If you accept one, you accept the other. Premises can be seductive and still be wrong." She considered this. "That's fair," she said. Then she reached out and took the book back, and I realized I had simply handed it to her, and that we had been arguing about a point of natural philosophy for approximately 2 minutes, which was longer than I had willingly spoken to any guest at Thornvast Hall since my wife died. I found I did not know what to do with that information. I stayed in the library that morning for 4 hours, as I always did. So did she. We did not speak again except once, when I reached for a volume on the upper shelf of the north case and found that it was not where it should have been. I said nothing aloud, but I must have made some sound, because she said from the window seat without looking up, "Second shelf from the top, between the surveying texts. Someone reshelved it incorrectly about a year ago, judging by the dust pattern." I looked. She was right. I said thank you and returned to my reading, and she said, "You're welcome," and turned a page, and that was all. But I was aware for the rest of that morning of a quality of stillness in the room that was different from the stillness I was accustomed to. My usual morning silence was the silence of a man alone. This was something else. This was the silence of two people reading, each aware of the other, neither requiring anything more than that. I had not known such a thing was possible. I had certainly not known I wanted it. The first formal dinner of our acquaintance occurred 3 days after her arrival, as the contract stipulated. I had instructed Mrs. Aldcroft, my housekeeper, to set the table at its usual length, which put my chair at one end and the guests at the other, separated by approximately 12 feet of polished mahogany and 6 candlesticks. This, too, was by design. Emmeline arrived to the dining room at exactly the appointed hour, which I noted because most guests arrived slightly late as a matter of social convention, the lateness functioning as a small performance of ease. She wore a dark blue dress that was not as fine as my other occasional guests wore to dinner, but which she wore with the complete indifference to its status of someone who had already decided that her value was not located in the fabric. She sat where she was placed, looked down the 12 feet of candle-lit table at me, and said, "Is this length of table strictly necessary, or is it by preference?" "Convention," I said. "I see," she said. Then she looked at the 6 candlesticks between us and said nothing further on the subject, but I had the distinct impression that she had formed and filed an opinion. I asked her the questions a host was required to ask: whether her rooms were comfortable, whether she had everything she needed, whether she had found the grounds tolerable. She answered each one directly. The rooms were adequate and warmer than she expected, which was good. She had found she needed a dictionary and had located one on the library's south shelf, which satisfied that requirement. The grounds were extensive, and she intended to walk them systematically in order to understand the layout, which seemed to her the most efficient approach. "Most people explore more spontaneously," I said. "I find spontaneity produces an incomplete picture," she said. "I prefer to know where I am." I thought of the notebook she had produced from her pocket when she stepped out of the carriage, and what she had written in it when she first saw the house, and I said, What did you write in your notebook when you arrived?" She looked at me with a flicker of something, the first thing she had allowed me to see that was not entirely composed. "You were watching from the study window," she said. "I was." A brief pause. "I wrote down the number of windows and the approximate age of the stone. I like to have a picture of a place before I enter it." "And the picture you formed?" She looked at the candles between us. "Old," she said, "heavy, used to being looked at but not used to being inhabited quite, as though the house had been arranged for a portrait rather than a life." She glanced up. "That was unkind, I'm sorry." "It was accurate," I said. She looked at me steadily. "Yes," she said, "I believe it was." I had the table shortened the following week. I did not announce this to her or to Hartwell. The candlesticks were reduced to 3. When she arrived for the second formal dinner and found me only 4 feet away rather than 12, she said nothing, but she settled into her chair with a particular quality of ease that I had not seen in her before, a settling in rather than a setting down. And the dinner that followed was the first unhurried conversation I could remember having in a very long time. The week passed, then another. I had expected to find her difficult. What I found instead was that she was simply precise. She said what she meant. She did not embellish or perform. She did not tell me she found Thornvast Hall beautiful when she did not. She told me, at our second formal dinner, that the east drawing room was too cold because the chimney flue was partially blocked, that she could tell because the smoke curled left instead of rising, and that Hartwell had told her the chimney sweep came in March, but that March seemed a long way away. She said this not as a complaint but as an observation, with the same quality of attention she gave to everything, as though the world were a set of problems each of which had a solution, if you were willing to look carefully enough. I had the chimney seen to by the end of the week. I noticed other things. I noticed that she ate very little at dinner but drank her tea with absolute commitment. I noticed that she spent an hour each evening in the walled garden regardless of the weather, walking the same path along the south wall, and that she always looked up at the same point, a gap in the stone where a climbing plant had died and left a window of sky. I noticed that she kept the notebook in her coat pocket always and wrote in it in a hand so small I could not read it even when I stood close enough to. And I will admit that on one occasion I stood close enough to try. She had noticed me too. I understood this not because she said so, but because she began leaving things. Not deliberately, or not, I think, in any conscious way. But I would find, when I came to my usual chair in the library, that the book she had finished the day before was left on the side table with a folded page marking the passage she had thought most worth returning to. I would come to the evening sitting room and find that the fire had been stoked an hour before I usually arrived, not by any servant I could identify when I asked, though I did not ask directly. And once, coming in from the East Terrace late in the afternoon with mud on my boots and the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent too many hours being efficient and courteous and nothing else, I found a cup of tea on the study desk, still hot, with no explanation. I asked Hartwell. He said, very carefully, "I believe Miss Ashby came through the study on her way to the library, Your Grace." The study was not on the way to the library. The study was in the opposite wing. I said nothing, but I drank the tea and I remained at my desk, and I was aware that something in my chest had shifted very slightly, like a stone that has been sitting in the same groove for years and has finally loosened by a fraction. Not fallen, not gone, just loose, just barely willing to be moved. There were visitors in our 4th week. Lady Penrose and her daughter came from the neighboring estate, and I understood from Hartwell's preliminary briefing that Lady Penrose had known me since my first marriage, and had what she described as a maternal interest in my welfare, which in practice meant she watched me very closely for signs of deterioration, and occasionally offered to send her daughter to remedy it. The daughter, Miss Rosalind Penrose, was considered a great beauty in the county and was fully aware of it. She had never been to Thornvast Hall before, and her survey of the rooms and their contents was of a proprietary nature that I found immediately wearing. Her survey included Emmeline. They were introduced in the front drawing room. Emmeline wore the gray wool dress she seemed to prefer above the others, and she stood with her usual stillness, while Lady Penrose took her in with the specific assessment of a woman who has spent 40 years ranking other women. And I watched Emmeline watch Lady Penrose watch her, and I watched Emmeline decide, in approximately 4 seconds, that there was nothing here she needed to compete with or be diminished by. And I watched her come to that decision, with a calm so absolute it would have looked like indifference to anyone who did not know how to read her. I was beginning to know how to read her. Miss Rosalind Penrose was vivid and accomplished, and she laughed with the bright, carrying laugh of someone who has learned that the right sound at the right moment is a tool. She directed most of her conversation at me, and I answered with the courtesy I reserved for obligations I intended to be brief. She spoke, in the manner of a woman testing water, about the county's social engagements, about the winter assembly at Alderton, about which families were in residence. She asked questions designed to establish that she was at ease in any room of consequence, and Emmeline listened to all of it with her hands folded and her face precisely neutral, and said nothing until Miss Penrose said, lightly, "Miss Ashby, you are so wonderfully quiet. I imagine life at Thornvast Hall must be rather a relief after, wherever it was you were before." There was a small pause. Emmeline said, "I find quiet useful. It lets you hear things that would otherwise be missed." She looked at Miss Penrose with the direct, undefended gray gaze I had come to think of as her particular signature. "For instance, I've noticed that you've mentioned the Alderton Assembly 3 times in the past quarter hour. Thornvast Hall does not attend it as a rule." She turned to me. "Do you attend it, Your Grace?" "I do not," I said. "Then I imagine," Emmeline said, still looking at Miss Penrose with absolute gentleness, "that the assembly will be very well attended by other excellent people, and I hope you enjoy it." It was not a cut. It was not a cruelty. It was precise and it was soft, and it closed the door so quietly that it took Miss Penrose a full half-minute to realize it had been closed at all. Lady Penrose's eyebrows rose perhaps 3 millimeters. I looked at the fire and felt something in me that I had not felt in many years, which was, I realize now, pure and uncomplicated admiration. The visit ended. Lady Penrose paused in the entrance hall to press my hand and look at me with an expression I had seen her use on charitable cases and on matters she considered settled, which I chose to interpret however I chose. Her daughter preceded her out the door without looking back, which was perhaps just as well. Emmeline returned to the library. I sat with Hartwell that evening for the household accounts, and found I could not concentrate on them, because I kept returning, in my mind, to the way she had said the assembly will be very well attended by other excellent people, and the way she had turned to me before she said it, and I had to set the accounts aside and sit with it for rather a long time before I could think about anything else. The month of November gave way to December. The garden lost its last color, and the sky sat low and white over the grounds, and the morning light in the library went from gray to silver too, on certain mornings, a flat gold that came in low through the east windows and caught the dust on the shelves and turned it briefly luminous. Emmeline had taken, by now, to leaving her coat on the hook by the library door, and her notebook on the window seat between sessions, and there was something about the presence of her coat on my hook and her notebook on my window seat that I had ceased to argue with, internally, at some point I could not precisely identify. We talked more. We talked about the book she was reading and the book I was reading, about the argument in the natural philosophy volume, which had never fully been resolved between us, about the history of the estate, which she had learned from a survey map she had found in the lower shelf of the East case, and which turned out to contain an error she had corrected in pencil without informing anyone. I found the correction 3 days after she made it, in handwriting so small and precise it looked like a correction in a professional document, not a guest's amendment to a private library's archive. "You changed my map," I said. "It was wrong," she said, without looking up from her book. "You corrected a document belonging to this house without asking." She looked up at that. The gray eyes were steady. "Would you have preferred the map to remain wrong?" I thought about this for a moment. "No," I said. "Then the outcome is the same," she said, and returned to her book. I kept the correction. I also, in the following week, found myself looking more carefully at the other maps in the East case, and I discovered that she had made 3 further corrections, each in that same miniature hand, each entirely accurate. I found them one by one over the course of a fortnight, and each time I found one I felt the same thing, which was something between amusement and a quality of warmth I had no category for. The December correspondence brought several invitations to winter dinners at neighboring houses, and because the terms of our mutual acquaintance required a degree of public presence, I accepted 2 of them, which was more than I had accepted in any single month in the previous 3 years. Hartwell received this information with visible surprise, which he managed with admirable speed. I did not explain my reasoning. Emmeline prepared for both engagements with the same systematic approach she brought to everything. She asked me, the week before the first dinner, to tell her who would be present and what the standard conversational requirements would be, and I sat with her in the library one evening after supper and described, person by person, the cast of the Harwood dinner party. Sir Harwood himself, a man of good humor and better wine; his wife, whose primary interest was gardens and whose secondary interest was other people's arrangements; the Reverend Castley and his wife, who were kind; a distant Harwood cousin from the north who had opinions about enclosure; and Lord and Lady Alvanley, who were considered fashionable and knew it. Emmeline listened to all of this with her notebook open on her knee, making small notations. "Is Lord Alvanley the sort of man who interrupts?" she asked. "He is," I said. "And Lady Alvanley, does she mind it?" "She has the look of a woman who gave up minding things 15 years ago." Emmeline wrote something in her notebook. "I see," she said. She looked up. "And you, are you comfortable in these settings?" The question surprised me. Not its content, it was a reasonable question, but its direction. She was looking at me with the same careful attention she gave to every other problem, except that the problem, this time, was my comfort. "I find them manageable," I said. "That isn't the same thing," she said. It was not. I had been managing large rooms of people for 30 years with the specific efficiency of a man who had decided that being managed was better than being known. She saw that in 4 words and said so, quietly, without pushing. "No," I said after a moment, "it isn't." She closed her notebook. "Then I shall sit near you," she said, "and when it becomes merely manageable rather than something better, you can ask me about the map correction and we will have something to talk about that I am quite certain no one else in the room will have an opinion on." I looked at her across the table. The candle between us was burning low, and the light of it was warm on her face, and she met my gaze with the honest steadiness that I had come to understand was simply how she was in the world, not a performance of calm but the real thing, the bone of her. "That is a very practical solution," I said. "I generally find that practical solutions are the kindest ones," she said. And she picked up her book, and we said nothing else for the better part of an hour, and it was, again, the comfortable 2 people reading silence that I had come to rely on more than I had the words to say. The Harwood dinner was on a Tuesday. We rode in the carriage together in the dark, the lanes narrow between the hedgerows, the frost beginning to sit on the fields. She had her notebook in her coat pocket. She did not look out the window but sat with her hands folded and her gaze focused on some middle distance, working something through in her mind the way she always did when I had not yet said anything that required her attention. "Are you nervous?" I asked. She considered this honestly. "Not in the way most people mean. I know what to expect. It is only the knowing and the reality never quite matching that I find tiring." She looked at me. "You." "I have been attending these dinners since I was 20, I said. "That wasn't what I asked," she said gently. "No," I said, "I know." There was a pause, and then I said, very quietly, "I find it easier when I am not alone in the room." She looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded once, with the same matter-of-fact acceptance with which she absorbed most truths, as though she had suspected this and was glad to have it confirmed. And we did not speak again until the carriage arrived at Harwood House, but something in the interior of that carriage was different by the end of the short journey. A slightly altered weight, a thing that had been unsaid and was now, though not in so many words, said. The dinner was precisely as I had described it. Lord Alvanley interrupted the Reverend Castley twice before the soup was cleared. Lady Alvanley watched the ceiling. Sir Harwood was warm and the wine was excellent, and Mrs. Harwood asked Emmeline 3 questions about gardens in a row, and listened to each answer with the genuine attention of a person who finds both the subject and the speaker interesting. I watched Emmeline talk about the climbing plants she intended for the walled garden at Thornvast Hall, the gap in the south wall that needed covering, the variety best suited to the climate, the timing of planting in the spring, and I watched Mrs. Harwood's face move from polite inquiry to real interest, and I thought, she does this everywhere. She walks into a room and within an hour someone is genuinely glad she came, and she does it by being exactly herself and not one particle more. Across the table, Lord Alvanley said something about a report he had read regarding drainage policy on agricultural land, and I began to answer him, and from 2 seats away I heard Emmeline say, to the Harwood cousin from the north, "The report he's referring to, the one from the Commission in March. The measurements in the 3rd section are almost certainly based on a misread instrument. The margin of error would account for the discrepancy between the eastern and western holdings." "Has anyone written to the Commission?" She said it with the same directness and the same absolute absence of performance with which she said everything, and the Harwood cousin, who had opinions about enclosure and who had been looking slightly bored, sat up, and they talked about drainage rights and instrument calibration for the remainder of the 2nd course, and I am fairly certain it was the best conversation the Harwood cousin had had in the county that year. On the way home, in the carriage, she was quiet. The frost had deepened, and the fields on either side of the lane were silver under a half-moon. I said, "The drainage report, you've read it." "I read everything I can find," she said. "My uncle had a small but useful subscription to the Parliamentary Digest. It was the one advantage of his household." The Harwood cousin looked as though someone had handed him a gift, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "People are usually surprised when I know things. I find it less surprising every year." She looked out the window. "It was a kind evening, though. Mrs. Harwood she is the sort of person I should like to know better." "I will arrange it," I said. She looked at me. "You don't have to." "I know," I said. Something shifted in the carriage again. She looked out the window at the frost-silver fields, and I looked at the side of her face in the dark, and I thought, I have been telling myself for 2 months that this is a contract, a practical arrangement, a resolution to an account. And I have been, I see now, wrong about all of it. The 2nd county engagement was a smaller affair. A supper at the Reverend Castley's house, 6 people, candlelight, and a great deal of excellent conversation about parish matters that I would normally have found tedious and found instead perfectly pleasant, because Emmeline was to my left, and she asked the Reverend about the history of the church at Thornvast village with the specific, unhurried interest of someone who genuinely wants to know, and the Reverend, who had spent 30 years hoping someone would ask, talked for 40 minutes straight and went home, I was told afterward, in higher spirits than his wife had seen in a considerable time. In the carriage home from that evening, I was the one who spoke first. I said, You have a talent for making people feel that what they know is worth the telling." She was quiet for a moment. The lanes were dark and the horses steady, and the interior of the carriage was the warm, compressed dark of a small shared space. "Most people," she said, "know something extraordinary if you find the right subject. The Reverend has been custodian of that church for 3 decades. No one has asked him about it before because the information doesn't seem immediately useful. But it is interesting. Most things are if you look at them properly. And if the information is not interesting." She considered this with her usual honesty. "Then I have at least learned something about what a person finds important," she said, "which is often more interesting than the subject itself." I thought about this for what remained of the journey. I thought about the things she had found important in the months she had been at Thornvast Hall: the library catalog, the chimney flue, the gap in the garden wall, the map correction, the drainage report, and I understood, arriving at the hall and handing her down from the carriage step in the dark with the frost sparkling on the stones, that what she found important was almost entirely the things that were being overlooked, and that this was not an accident but the whole shape of her. She kept my hand for a moment longer than was necessary when she stepped down from the carriage. She said, "Thank you for this evening," in the same direct, unhurried way she said everything, and went inside, and I stood on the frost-bright stones for a moment longer than was necessary, watching the door. There were 2 more weeks of December before the solicitor's letter arrived, and in those 2 weeks I learned several things I had not known about myself. I learned that I had become, without deciding to, someone who came to the library slightly earlier than usual because I wanted to be there when she arrived. I learned that the household meals I had eaten in silence for 6 years had become the part of the day I looked forward to most, not for the food, which had always been good, but for the particular quality of conversation we had developed over the months, not social performance, not the careful navigation of drawing rooms, but the direct, curious, alive exchange of 2 people who had both, in their different ways, been short of it for a long time. I learned that I had been sleeping better, which Hartwell noted by not noting it, which was his way. And I learned, one morning in the 2nd week of December, that I had been wrong about something I had held as fact for 6 years, which was the belief that a man could be sufficient to himself if he organized his life precisely enough. It was a Tuesday, very early, the frost still on the inside of the window glass, when I came down to the library before the fire was lit. I built the fire myself. I had not done this since I was a young man, and I sat in the usual chair with the usual book, and I was not reading it. I was thinking about nothing in particular, which I had also not done in a long time, and the door opened and she came in, still in her coat, her cheeks cold from the east wing corridor, and she stopped when she saw me and said, "You're early," and I said, "I know," and she came and sat in the window seat without taking her coat off and said, without preamble, "I couldn't sleep either." We looked at each other across the unlit library, the fire beginning to take in the grate between us. "It is very quiet here," she said. "I mean that as a good thing. I have spent a great deal of my life in quiet that was unfriendly. This is a different kind." "What kind?" I asked, though I thought I knew. She considered. "The kind that comes from 2 people not needing to fill the space," she said, "rather than from one person having no one to fill it with." That was, I think, the most precisely true thing anyone had said to me in 6 years. I sat with it, and she sat with it, and the fire built slowly in the grate, and the frost on the window glass began to soften, and we were both very still, and it was the best quiet I had known. It was Hartwell who said the thing I had been not saying, in the oblique way Hartwell had when he felt something needed to be said, and had decided that the obliqueness gave both of us an exit if I chose to take it. He came to me one morning in the 2nd week of December with the household accounts and a letter from my solicitor regarding the terms of the contract, and he set both down on the desk and said, "The 3 months will be up in January, Your Grace. I thought you would want the reminder." "I am aware," I said. "Yes, Your Grace." He paused. He had the account ledger in his hands, and he was holding it in the slightly raised way that meant he had more to say and was deciding whether to say it. The staff have found Miss Ashby to be very, he looked for the word. Settled, he said at last. Settled. Yes, she has a way of being in a room that is, another pause. Calming, they say, particularly the younger maids. She explained to Dora why the kitchen chimney smokes on north-facing days, and Dora told Cook, and apparently Cook has been adjusting the damper since last Tuesday, and the kitchen has been, he stopped. Warm, he said, for the first time in 3 winters. I looked at him, he looked at the ledger. Is there anything else, Hartwell? Only the solicitor's letter, he said, and set it down and left. I did not open the solicitor's letter that day. I sat with it on the desk for the better part of an hour and then put it under the account ledger and went to the library. And Emmeline was already there, as she always was now, and the room had the quality of 2 people reading stillness that I had come to rely on in a way I had not examined closely, because I had known, at some level, that examining it closely would require me to do something about what I found. She was reading a collection of letters by a natural historian I had bought from an estate sale the previous spring. I had intended to read it myself. I had not. It had been sitting on the second shelf of the south case with a thin film of dust on its spine, and she had found it by the systematic method she applied to every wall of shelving, starting at the left end of each row and moving right, reading every title, taking down the ones that interested her. A process she had told me she found more reliable than browsing by section, because she said that catalogers' decisions about what belonged where were frequently personal and arbitrary, and she preferred to make her own. I said, I have a letter from my solicitor. She looked up. The 3 months, I said, the contract terms. She looked at me with the gray, direct, fully honest gaze and said, I know. I have not opened it. A pause, neither would I, she said. I sat down in the chair opposite her. The fire was burning well. She had learned, without being asked, to add the heavier log second, and the kitchen chimney ran warm, and the house in December was easier than it had been in the 3 previous Decembers. I was aware of all of this in the way you become aware of things only when you have finally stopped trying not to. My wife died 6 years ago, I said. It was not something I said. I did not, as a rule, say it to anyone who had not already known it. She waited. She was ill for 2 years before that, I said. I knew the house was going to be empty. I organized it for emptiness, the routines, the distance. I told myself it was efficient. I looked at the fire. It was efficient. Efficiency is useful, she said after a moment. It can also be a way of not having to notice what's missing. I looked at her. She was watching the fire too, and her face had the careful, honest quality of someone who has said the true thing and is waiting to see if the person they have said it to will take it or set it down. I said, you were not what I expected. I rarely am, she said, not with bitterness, simply as a fact. In the county, she said, after a moment, the word most people use for me is strange. My uncle uses it the way people use the word difficult, as though it explains why a problem hasn't been solved. I notice things other people would rather not have noticed. I say what I think, which most people find uncomfortable because they have spent a great deal of effort not saying what they think. I find it tiring, all of that, the effort of performing a kind of thinking I don't have. She was still looking at the fire. The gold of it lit the side of her face. I do not find you strange, I said. She looked at me then. The look was the direct, unguarded gray of it, and there was something in it that was different from any other look she had given me in 2 months, something that was not purely analytical, something that was also afraid and also hoping and also very still. The contract can be dissolved, she said. I understand the terms. I could go. She paused. I would not resent it. I want you to know that. This has been, she stopped, looked back at the fire. I have been unexpectedly content here. Unexpectedly content. Said in the same tone, a careful person uses when the true word is something much larger, and they are not yet sure they have permission for it. I said, I do not want to dissolve the contract. She looked at me again. I want, I said, to open the solicitor's letter and see what steps remain to make the arrangement permanent. I paused. If that is what you want. A long silence. Long enough that I was aware of the fire and of the silver light outside the window and of the absolute stillness of her and the absolute stillness of me, and the quality of it, not the empty stillness of a man alone in a room he has arranged around his own absence, but something else, something full. I will tell you what I felt in that silence, because I think it is the heart of what I have been trying to say across all this telling. I felt, for the first time in 6 years, that I was in the right place. Not a place I had chosen for efficiency, not a place I had arranged to be tolerable, but the right place, the one where the particular shape of me fit the particular shape of the room and the person in it. I had not known, until that moment, how long I had been waiting to feel that. I had not known it was something a person could still find after 40 years, and a great deal of loss. She was still looking at the fire. The candlelight and the firelight together made the room warm in a way it had not been for a very long time, and her face in that light was the face I had been learning for 3 months without knowing I was learning it. The exact angle of her profile, the way she held very still when she was thinking something through, the particular quality of her attention, which was not the performing kind but the real kind, the kind that meant she was actually there. Yes, she said. It was a small word, and she said it quietly, and it was the clearest thing I had heard in 6 years. Then she looked at me, and for the first time there was no precision in it, no careful management. She simply looked at me, and I saw her, and she let herself be seen, which I understood was not something she had often done, and which, I suspect, neither had I. I reached across the table and took her hand. She was not wearing gloves. She rarely did in the library, which I had noticed and never remarked on, and her hand was small and cool, and she did not pull it back. She looked down at my hand over hers with the focused attention she brought to everything that mattered, and then she turned her palm up very slightly and closed her fingers and held on. We stayed there by the fire in the winter library for a long time after that, not speaking, not needing to. Her coat was on my hook and her notebook was on the window seat, and the natural historian's letters were open on the table, and the fire was burning warm, and it was the most at home I had felt in 6 years, or perhaps ever, because there is a difference between belonging in a house and belonging in a house with someone who sees you, and I had not, until that day, understood that difference from the inside. There were practicalities. There are always practicalities, and I have learned in the years since that Emmeline regards practicalities with the same systematic attention she gave the library catalog as problems with solutions, each one if you look at them carefully enough. The solicitor's letter outlined the steps, the bands, the reading, the date. She read the letter herself when I gave it to her, in the same way she read everything, thoroughly, from the first word, making one small note in her notebook that I did not ask about and she did not explain. There was the matter of her uncle. He came to Thornvast Hall in the 3rd week of December, summoned by a letter from my solicitor about the restructuring of terms. He arrived looking like a man who expects bad news and has dressed for it. He was shown to the front drawing-room. I met him there. He sat with his hat in his hands, and his eyes moving from the door to the window to the floor in the restless triangulation of a man who has lost the right to be comfortable in his own skin. "Your Grace," he said, "I trust the arrangements have been satisfactory." "More than satisfactory," I said. He blinked. He had not expected that word. "The debt will be settled," I said, "in full. The terms are in the letter from my solicitor which you have received. There is also a separate provision." I looked at him steadily. Miss Ashby's own account, her access to independent funds, the structure of her arrangements within this house, those terms are now separate from the debt resolution. They are not dependent on it. Do you understand what I'm saying? He understood. The color in his face went through several adjustments. "She is no longer," I said, "an arrangement you have the power to renegotiate." "Your Grace, I assure you I never." "I know what you did," I said without heat. "I am telling you what it means going forward, that is all." He left. He left more quickly than he had arrived, which I had not thought possible, and I watched his carriage disappear down the drive from the entrance hall window with something that was not quite satisfaction, but was perhaps its quieter cousin. Emmeline was in the library. She had, I had noticed, taken to staying in the library when the house had visitors she had not invited, which was her version of a dignified withdrawal that managed to be entirely undramatic. I found her on the window seat, watching the kitchen garden. The last of the autumn's dead growth was still standing in the beds, stiff and gray-brown against the white sky. "He's gone," I said. "I heard the carriage," she said. She was still looking at the garden. "Did you tell him?" "I told him what needed saying." She nodded once and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There is a garden at Ashby, the house where I grew up. It is very badly maintained and has been for years. There was a gardener who used to know every plant in it by name, and when he retired, no one replaced him properly. I used to spend a great deal of time there anyway." She looked at the window. "It didn't matter that it was untended. It was the one place that didn't require anything of me. I said, we can do something with this one, in the spring, if you wanted." She looked at me. The fire was behind me, and the afternoon light was falling through the window across her coat and her hands, and the notebook on the seat beside her. "Yes," she said, "I think I'd like that very much." The wedding was in February. I have been asked in the years since whether there was a grand occasion, a public ceremony with the county assembled to bear witness. There was not. We married in the chapel at Thornvast Hall on a morning when light snow was falling on the stone, soft and silent, without any of the drama that a larger audience might have required. Hartwell stood at the back with an expression of such thorough and carefully contained relief that I have teased him about it across 3 decades since, without exhausting the subject. Mrs. Aldcroft wept, very quietly, into a handkerchief she had thought to bring. 2 of the maids who had drawn lots for the morning correspondence stood in the corridor outside the chapel door and smiled at each other when we came out. Emmeline wore a cream wool dress that she had chosen herself with the same practical certainty with which she chose everything, and she carried a small bunch of winter berries from the kitchen garden, not hothouse flowers, not the elaborate arrangements most women of her station would have accepted without question, but the winter berries from the garden she was already beginning to think of as hers, and they were more beautiful than anything a florist could have produced because they were exactly what she meant. She looked at me when the words were said, and I looked at her, and in her face was the thing I had come to know as the truest version of her, the directness, and the stillness, and beneath them, now visible, the warmth she had never wasted on people who couldn't see it. She gave me her hand. I took it. There is a moment in every story like this one, and I am aware that this is a story, that I am a man of 60 telling it to the gray ceiling of a room I have shared with the same woman for 30 years, where the great declarations are made, the sweeping public claims, the moments that the novels make much of. I have told you the library, and the tea on the study desk, and the carriage home from Harwood in the frost, and the hand held by the fire in December. I have given you what I consider the whole of it. What I will add is only this. She had not made me over. That is not what happened between us, and I would not have you think it was. I was still the man who spent 4 hours in the library every morning, who needed the silence of the hall and the particular rhythms of the house. She was still the woman who counted corbels and corrected maps and looked at the world with the unembellished gray clarity that most of the county found unnerving. We were not soft people who had been made softer. We were, I think the precise word is clearer. We had both, in our different ways, lived behind walls that were not entirely dishonest. Her wall was the precision, the stillness, the refusal to perform a warmth she didn't have, and mine was the distance, the efficiency, the morning alone in the library. The difference was that the walls had, in each other's company, become unnecessary. She told me once, in about the 5th year of our marriage, on a summer evening in the walled garden when the climbing plant she had installed in the first spring had grown across the gap in the south wall and begun to flower, that the thing she had found most remarkable about Thornvast Hall was not the library, though the library was remarkable. The thing she had found most remarkable, she said, looking at the climbing flowers in the gap in the wall, was that she had been expected to be a problem and had instead been given space to be a person, and that this was rarer than she had known how to articulate. I said, "You were never the problem." She said, "I know that now." She said it the same way she said everything, directly, without performance, with the specific honesty of a woman who had spent enough years in a world that didn't know what to do with her to understand the value of a place that did. And then she turned from the flowers and took my hand, which she had always done with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who knows exactly where they belong and has decided not to waste any more time pretending otherwise. And I kept her hand. That is the whole of it, or as much of it as fits into an evening's telling. I was the most feared man in 3 counties and the emptiest house in the county, and she was the debt that nobody wanted, and the woman they said no one would take, and the contract that was supposed to be a resolution to an inconvenient account turned out to be the truest arrangement of my life. She corrected the map. She found the misfiled book. She saw the smoke curling wrong in the chimney and said so, plainly, because that is how she spoke, and how she saw, and how she moved through the world, with the clear, unsparing, honest attention of a person who had always been able to see exactly what was there, even when what was there was a duke standing in the doorway of his own library looking more lost than he knew. The smiling ancestors on the west wall, she told me in our first year, were the ones who had lived for love. She was confident of this, she said, because the painted eyes were different, not better painted, different in the thing they were looking at. We are on that wall now, both of us, in a portrait from our 12th year. Hartwell chose the painter. Emmeline told the painter directly that she did not intend to smile in the commissioned way, but that she would look at whatever she actually wanted to look at, and that if the painter felt this was a problem he should say so now. The painter, who was a sensible man, said it was not a problem, and in the portrait she is looking at me, and I am looking at her, and I am smiling. I was past 40 when it was painted, which means the pattern holds, and she was wrong, and I shall not tell her so because she was right about nearly everything else, and this one small error is mine to keep. The truth, of course, is that being loved by her has made everything in my life better, including the years, and I expect to continue to be wrong about the smiling ancestors theory for a very long time yet. That is the arrangement we have settled on. I have found, at this late stage in the accounting of my life, that it is by a considerable margin the best bargain I have ever made.